Hey, yeah, it's me again, Captain Dan, on the 10th Street Bridge in Owen Sound, and there goes a duck, yeah. And today we're going to talk briefly about the Carboniferous, because, yeah, that's an important period in the history of life. So, yeah, let's talk about it. Okay. So now I'm down at Kelso with the ducks, and that's always a good place to be. Absolutely. Anyway, the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous started at 360 million years ago and continued until 300 million years ago. So, yeah, about 60 million years of time in which there was a whole lot of interesting evolutionary changes that we can talk about. So one of the big evolutionary events of the Carboniferous was, of course, the extinction of the placoderms, the armored fishes, in the late Carboniferous. They just kind of disappeared, leaving the world's oceans to the ray-finned fishes, the bony-finned fishes, and the cartilaginous fishes, including sharks and rays. And again, as I've said before, yay sharks! However, another big evolutionary change was the rise of reptiles, also in the late Carboniferous. And reptiles are descended from a side branch of amphibians. Yeah. So the amphibians weren't having it all their own way quite yet either. Yeah. But yes, the Carboniferous was definitely a time when amphibians dominated. And the amphibians did well. And the reptiles just sort of emerged from the amphibians, as it were. Hey, yeah, but how exactly did that happen? Well, a few key evolutionary changes that made it all happen, really. One group of amphibians evolved a characteristic of hard, tough, waterproof scales on their skin, which allowed them to retain bodily moisture so they could spend longer out in the sun. And this allowed them to venture further and further from the water. And around the same time, they also developed a tough, keratinous shell for their eggs, so they could lay their eggs on dry land without fear that their eggs would shrivel up and die. And this is really what separates amphibians and reptiles, is the ability to live on dry land 24/7, 365 days a year. It's that amazing little evolved difference. Yeah. And so reptiles conquered the inland regions far away from rivers and streams and swamps and estuaries and seacoasts. They colonized the desert. And more power to them. This allowed reptiles to exploit certain types of plants that had found it useful to live in drier areas where water was something you got once a year or maybe once a decade. Because yes, plants had been evolving through the Carboniferous era to live in increasingly dry and hostile environments, further and further away from the marshes, the rivers, and the estuaries, again, that plants had really taken over completely. Of course, insects had beat the reptiles into the dry areas of the world, but that's another story entirely. We'll talk about that later. Now, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here and talk about a young Earth creationist habit of misattributing the words of an economist named Herbert Spencer, who said, and I quote, "Survival of the fittest," when talking about the competition between corporate entities. And this quote is very often misattributed by these creationists to one Mr. Charles Darwin, who didn't actually say it. Yeah, that's the thing with that. And the creationists not only misattribute the quote, they also misapply it by insisting that evolution must therefore be an endless competition of violence, as every animal battles to be the one animal that survives. Kind of a dark and twisted Hobbesian ideology, really. It has nothing to do with Darwin, nothing to do with evolution, and everything to do with the misinterpretations of Hobbes and Spencer. One an economist, the other a philosopher and satirist. Oh yes. Hobbes also posited that life was an endless, painful struggle in which the nobility would always prevail over the peasantry, to the point where, when the world came to an end, the nobles would eat the peasants, and then eat one another until only the king was left, and then the king would starve to death. This is Thomas Hobbes's universe, not Charles Darwin's universe. We can, however, apply Darwinian reasoning to the concept of survival of the fittest, in the sense that those populations, not individuals, who are the best fit for their environment will tend to do better. For instance, the small, weak scavenger will thrive in a hostile environment where a big, strong predator will not thrive and, in fact, will die off quickly because its food requirements are too great. Absolutely. Survival of the fittest. In this case, the fittest being the one that is best able to fit the environment. Something to think about, don't you think? And with this, we can then move on to a greater understanding of what constitutes evolutionary fitness. Again, fitness is not about the biggest, strongest, and meanest killing off everybody smaller and weaker than themselves, but rather it is about those best able to survive in their environment, simply outcompeting those less able to thrive in their environment because they don't fit the environment. In other words, again, with the example of these small, weak scavengers outperforming the big, strong carnivores, yeah, the best fit for the environment isn't always muscle. Sometimes it's endurance. And that's how it works in the dance that is the coevolution of plants and insects. Now, insects are arthropods, and arthropods are a very ancient lineage dating back at least to the Cambrian period. But by the Carboniferous, a large number of groups of insects had already developed a very healthy symbiotic relationship with plants. Coevolution. Survival of the fittest being, in this case, survival of the groups, the populations that were best able to develop a coexistence. Yes, a coexistence that was mutually beneficial to both parties. Something to think about. And home at last. Yes, the plants and arthropods, most notably the insects, migrated into the drier parts of the world in the early Carboniferous. And then in the mid to late Carboniferous, one group of amphibians became reptiles and followed them into the dry parts of the world. Yeah, It's that simple.